You know the drill. The hospital is not a place for people like you to fake illness to get a seat.
I just need some pain medication. I don't feel well.
Doctor refused to treat homeless veteran, then discovered he saved the president's life. When Dr. Richard Coleman refused to treat homeless veteran Frank Morrison at St. Mary's emergency room, dismissing him as a drug-seeking vagrant, he had no idea that Frank was Medal of Honor recipient whose heroic service had protected American presidents during the nation's most dangerous moments. St. Mary's emergency room buzzed with 2 a.m. chaos. Nurses rushed between beds while doctors processed patients like factory workers. The smell of antiseptic mixed with human desperation. Here, insurance cards opened doors faster than medical need. Homeless patients waited in plastic chairs while paying customers received private rooms. Dignity was surrendered with possessions at security checkpoints. Frank Morrison sat in the waiting area with quiet dignity. At 68, his weathered hands showed scars from old injuries. 3 months homeless after medical bills consumed his savings. Chemical exposure treatment that VA healthcare couldn't fully cover had bankrupted him despite decades of government service. His worn jacket concealed stories that civilian world could never hear. Military service that had shaped American history. Operations so sensitive, their details remained classified 40 years later. What hospital staff saw was homeless man in dirty clothes seeking drugs or shelter. They missed invisible battles in Frank's careful posture. Decades of protecting American leaders while his own health deteriorated. Chemical exposure that military medicine slowly acknowledged. Disabilities that civilian employment couldn't accommodate. His medals remained in storage unit he couldn't afford. Frank's challenge transcended medical need. It was preserving dignity when healthcare treated homeless veterans as inconvenient burdens rather than heroes whose service had protected the institutions now rejecting them. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about. Tonight would reveal who understood true service. Frank's chest pains had worsened over 3 days. Chemical exposure plus untreated hypertension created cardiac emergency. St. Mary's was his last resort when free clinic closed and VA hospital was 40 miles away without transportation. Triage nurse Maria Santos assessed Frank professionally despite his appearance. "Sir, what brings you in tonight?" "Chest pains, shortness of breath," Frank replied with military precision. "Chemical exposure from service, hypertension, no current insurance due to homelessness following medical bankruptcy." Maria documented symptoms suggesting serious cardiac event. Emergency medicine should provide immediate attention regardless of payment status. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," Frank said quietly while waiting. "Tonight, I'm fighting to get help for heart problems that service created." But Dr. Coleman's approach would test whether emergency medicine served patients or profit margins when homeless veteran faced bias disguised as medical judgment. Dr. Coleman approached with visible irritation. 5 years of emergency medicine had made him cynical about homeless patients whose complex social problems complicated his preferred schedule of insured cases. "Mr. Morrison, you're here for chest pains?" Coleman asked suspiciously. "How long homeless? Using drugs or alcohol? Seeking pain medication from other hospitals?" Frank maintained patience. "Doctor, I'm former government employee experiencing cardiac symptoms from chemical exposure during service. No substance abuse, no medication seeking, just need medical evaluation." Coleman's bias prevented consideration. Sir, homeless patients often fabricate symptoms seeking controlled substances or shelter. Your appearance suggests chronic substance abuse despite claims about government service that records can't verify. Something flickered in Frank's eyes. Recognition of a battle he'd fought before. Not with bullets or bombs, but with assumptions. With people who judged books by covers. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, Doctor. My battles taught me to recognize character through actions rather than assumptions. Coleman prepared to discharge Frank without examination while violating federal EMTALA requirements. Coleman's refusal violated federal law requiring medical screening regardless of payment status. Mr. Morrison, this hospital doesn't provide social services for transients seeking accommodation. Contact homeless shelter for appropriate assistance. Frank's response carried dignity. Doctor, I'm experiencing cardiac emergency requiring evaluation. Federal law guarantees emergency care regardless of financial status. But Coleman's ignorance about EMTALA prevented recognition. Leave immediately, or security will escort you out for trespassing while disrupting operations designed to serve legitimate patients. Maria Santos witnessed the injustice while understanding Frank's symptoms, suggested serious cardiac event requiring immediate attention that medical ethics demanded. Frank gathered his dignity while preparing to leave despite potentially fatal cardiac emergency. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, Doctor. Some battles teach you what really matters when people need help most. Coleman dismissed the warning as empty threat from vagrant, whose appearance had triggered prejudice disguised as clinical judgment. But Maria couldn't ignore what she'd seen in Frank's eyes, something that told her this man's story was far different from his appearance. During a break, she would make a discovery that would change everything. Maria researched Frank Morrison government service during break. Search results revealed Medal of Honor recipient whose classified operations had protected American presidents during Cold War's most dangerous moments. The revelation shocked her. Frank Morrison, Presidential Security Detail, Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism during classified operations protecting chief executive from assassination attempts that would have altered American history. Maria discovered Frank's current homelessness resulted from medical bankruptcy. Chemical exposure treatment costs had exceeded veteran benefits, while VA healthcare couldn't provide comprehensive care for complex conditions requiring specialized treatment. She documented Coleman's EMTALA violation while coordinating with hospital administration about potential federal crime involving decorated hero, whose cardiac symptoms required immediate evaluation despite appearance-based assumptions about drug-seeking behavior. The research revealed institutional failure, where presidential protector was being treated as vagrant by medical system, forgetting obligations to veterans whose service had exceeded institutional understanding while requiring compassionate response rather than bias based on housing status. Hospital Administrator Sarah Chen received emergency report about Coleman's refusal, while Maria's research identified patient as Medal of Honor recipient whose discrimination could trigger federal investigation, threatening institutional reputation and Medicare funding. Chen reviewed Frank's case, understanding that EMTALA violation involving decorated veteran would attract Department of Health oversight, resulting in penalties exceeding millions annually through federal sanctions that hospital operations couldn't sustain. Emergency Medicine Director Dr. Patricia Hayes was summoned while Chen coordinated damage control, recognizing that bias against presidential hero represented institutional crisis, requiring immediate correction through proper medical care and comprehensive policy reform. "We have federal violation involving Medal of Honor recipient," Chen informed Hayes while reviewing documentation. "Patient protected American presidents, and we refused cardiac treatment based on appearance rather than symptoms." The crisis activated executive response while Frank remained in parking lot, experiencing cardiac emergency that medical bias had created through institutional prejudice, requiring immediate correction before federal authorities learned about the violation. Coleman remained unaware his prejudice had triggered administrative intervention, while Frank's heroic service was being documented by officials whose careers depended on preventing federal investigation. Hayes personally approached Frank in parking lot while coordinating emergency medical response, recognizing cardiac symptoms in Medal of Honor. Recipient required immediate treatment that Coleman's bias had denied through discrimination violating federal law. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Dr. Hayes, Emergency Director," she announced respectfully. "We need immediate cardiac evaluation. There's been serious error requiring correction through proper medical care." Frank demonstrated grace. "Doctor, I understand payment policies. Just need evaluation for symptoms that could be cardiac event." In this moment, Hayes saw what Coleman had missed: the quiet strength of someone who'd faced far worse than medical prejudice and emerged with dignity intact. Hayes assured payment wouldn't be discussed while coordinating comprehensive cardiac workup, recognizing chemical exposure plus untreated hypertension created medical emergency requiring intervention that hospital ethics demanded regardless of patient status. The response demonstrated proper emergency medicine while Coleman faced administrative accountability for federal violation that had endangered presidential hero's life through medical bias requiring immediate correction and policy reform. Hospital reputation depended on Medal of Honor recipient receiving delayed medical care while administration prepared response to physician prejudice that had violated everything healthcare claimed to represent through professional ethics. Frank's evaluation revealed active heart attack. Symptoms Coleman dismissed as drug-seeking were myocardial infarction requiring immediate intervention that medical bias had delayed through prejudice that could have proved fatal. "Mr. Morrison, you're having a heart attack requiring immediate surgery," Hayes announced while coordinating cardiac team. Chemical exposure plus untreated hypertension created serious event requiring emergency intervention. As Frank was wheeled to surgery, he caught Coleman's eye. No anger, no accusation, just a look that said, "Now you know the battle I was fighting." Frank processed information with military calm despite facing potential death that medical bias had nearly caused through Coleman's refusal providing proper screening that federal law required. Emergency surgery revealed extensive coronary damage that chemical exposure created, while untreated hypertension accelerated cardiac deterioration, requiring intervention that earlier care could have prevented through routine monitoring. Surgery success demonstrated proper medicine while exposing institutional failure, where presidential hero nearly died from cardiac event that bias had delayed through physician prejudice, violating federal law and professional ethics. Coleman watched his career crumble as his refusal to treat Medal of Honor recipient created federal violation and potential wrongful death case that hospital liability couldn't defend through malpractice insurance designed for clinical errors rather than discrimination. The cardiac crisis had nearly killed American hero through medical prejudice that would soon face consequences Coleman's training never addressed when authentic service faced institutional bias. Local news coverage of presidential hero denied medical care created national scandal as Frank's story revealed healthcare bias, while his Medal of Honor service demonstrated character that medical prejudice had failed to recognize. CNN interviewed Maria Santos. Doctor refused treatment to homeless man without examination, calling him drug seeker. Patient was Medal of Honor recipient who protected American presidents during classified operations. The revelation created impossible public relations situation as bias against presidential hero had been documented through federal violation that Department of Health would investigate, while media coverage attracted national attention. Frank's dignity throughout crisis inspired respect from medical community, whose professional ethics had been violated through Coleman's prejudice, while his heroic service provided moral authority that bias had attempted to dismiss. Hospital faced federal investigation while Coleman confronted career termination as his prejudice against homeless veteran had violated EMTALA requirements and professional ethics that healthcare licensing required. Media storm attracted veteran organizations whose response would ensure Frank received comprehensive care, while bias faced institutional accountability through federal oversight that medical prejudice triggered when proper authorities learned about violations. Department of Health launched investigation while Frank recovered from cardiac surgery that medical bias had nearly prevented through prejudice, violating federal law requiring emergency screening regardless of patient appearance. Coleman faced professional consequences while hospital administration prepared comprehensive response recognizing bias against Medal of Honor. Recipient represented institutional crisis requiring policy reform and public accountability. Frank received formal apology from hospital board, while veteran organizations coordinated ongoing support, ensuring presidential hero received comprehensive health care that his service had earned through sacrifice, exceeding anything medical community contributed to national security. In a moment of clarity, Coleman finally understood what he'd done. Visiting Frank's room, he saw the quiet dignity he'd missed. "Mr. Morrison, I was wrong, completely wrong. Your service, your sacrifice, I failed as a doctor tonight." Frank's response was characteristic. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, doctor. The question is what you learned from discovering someone else's battle." Investigation would determine whether Coleman's behavior represented individual prejudice or institutional problem requiring health care reform, addressing bias against homeless veterans whose service deserved recognition rather than discrimination. St. Mary's faced potential Medicare funding loss, while Frank became national advocate for homeless veteran health care, demonstrating authentic heroism transcended appearance-based prejudice when proper authorities intervened to restore dignity. Congressional Veterans Affairs Committee launched hearings investigating healthcare bias, while Frank's case inspired federal legislation requiring emergency screening with enhanced penalties for violations involving veterans whose service deserved institutional protection. Frank testified about bias. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about." When those battles involve protecting American presidents, the recognition should include basic health care rather than prejudice based on housing status. Coleman faced professional licensing review, while Frank received specialized treatment that his service had earned through presidential protection requiring ongoing support rather than neglect that had created his homelessness. The hearings established precedent that healthcare bias against veterans would face federal accountability, while Frank's advocacy influenced national policy protecting military heroes from institutional prejudice that violated professional ethics and federal law. Hospital implemented comprehensive reform, while Frank's story inspired similar protection nationwide, ensuring veteran homelessness wouldn't prevent medical treatment that military service had earned through sacrifice protecting American democracy. President Biden personally visited Frank during recovery, honoring their shared commitment to protecting American democracy while acknowledging institutional failure that had left presidential hero homeless, despite service requiring ongoing national gratitude. Frank, your service protected this office and American people, Biden said genuinely. Nation owes you comprehensive health care that should never have been questioned due to housing situation resulting from medical costs that veteran benefits should have covered. The moment was captured by every major network. Frank, in his hospital bed, receiving recognition that should have come decades earlier. His eyes misted, not from pain, but from finally being seen for who he truly was. Presidential visit established Frank's credentials, while hospital implemented lifetime health care program honoring his service through institutional recognition that bias had failed to acknowledge until heroic identity was properly documented. Coleman's career ended as bias against presidential hero became national example requiring his termination, while Frank received recognition that his service deserved through federal intervention, restoring dignity that medical prejudice had violated. Department of Veterans Affairs established comprehensive health care for homeless veterans, while Frank's case inspired federal legislation requiring emergency screening with severe penalties for violations, demonstrating that Coleman's behavior necessitated systemic reform. St. Mary's provided Frank lifetime health care while implementing protocols preventing future bias through training about veteran service requiring recognition rather than prejudice that had violated professional ethics and federal law. Frank became national spokesperson while Coleman faced permanent licensing loss, demonstrating that healthcare bias against veterans would face accountability through federal oversight, ensuring institutional protection for military heroes. Frank's cardiac rehabilitation was supported by a comprehensive medical team, while veteran organizations provided housing assistance that his service had earned through presidential protection, requiring ongoing support rather than neglect. The recovery demonstrated proper veteran health care while exposing failures that created Frank's homelessness through inadequate coverage requiring federal reform that his case inspired through national attention to bias against heroes whose service exceeded civilian understanding. Medical community received training about veteran homelessness, while Frank's advocacy influenced federal policy protecting military service from institutional prejudice, requiring professional accountability when vulnerable populations faced healthcare bias. Frank's advocacy influenced national policy, while his presidential recognition ensured ongoing support that bias had attempted to deny through institutional prejudice against homeless appearance, concealing authentic heroism that had protected American democracy. St. Mary's became model facility, while Frank received permanent housing and comprehensive medical support that his service had earned through presidential protection, requiring ongoing gratitude rather than prejudice, violating professional ethics. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, Frank told medical conferences. But when battles involve protecting American democracy, recognition should include lifetime health care rather than bias that federal intervention had to correct through comprehensive reform. 2 years later, Frank had become national advocate for homeless veteran health care while maintaining residents honoring his presidential service through comprehensive support that bias had attempted to deny, based on appearance concealing authentic heroism. The Frank Morrison Health Care Act required emergency screening regardless of payment status, while establishing severe penalties for bias against veterans whose service had earned institutional respect rather than prejudice, violating professional ethics and federal law. Coleman had left medicine, becoming advocate for homeless patients. Frank Morrison taught me that everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, he told audiences. My battle now is ensuring no doctor makes the same mistake I did. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, Frank concluded congressional testimony. But when battles involve protecting American presidents, the recognition creates lasting health care protection for others facing similar prejudice that requires institutional accountability rather than bias against people whose service exceeded their critics' contributions while deserving comprehensive care rather than judgment. Maria Santos, now head of Veteran Services at St. Mary's, often reflected on that night when she'd seen something special in Frank's eyes. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen not in laboratories, but in recognizing the hidden heroism walking among us, disguised by circumstances but never diminished by them. The Presidential Medal ceremony established Frank's legacy while ensuring homeless veterans received health care rather than bias, proving authentic character transcended institutional prejudice when proper recognition restored dignity. That prejudice had violated through medical bias, requiring federal intervention and comprehensive reform, protecting heroes whose invisible battles continued long after their visible service ended. Frank's case established federal standards for veteran health care, while EMTALA violations involving military heroes faced enhanced penalties that Coleman's prejudice had demonstrated were necessary to prevent bias against homeless veterans whose service deserved recognition. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, Frank told healthcare conferences nationwide. But when battles involve presidential protection, recognition should include comprehensive medical care rather than prejudice that federal intervention had to correct through reform protecting veterans from institutional bias. St. Mary's became national model, while Frank's advocacy ensured military service received proper medical recognition rather than prejudice that had violated professional ethics, requiring federal accountability when healthcare bias targeted heroes whose service exceeded civilian contributions. 5 years later, Frank had become elder statesman for veteran health care, while federal legislation bearing his name protected homeless veterans from medical bias through enhanced penalties that his case established, while ensuring comprehensive care rather than institutional prejudice. Coleman's transformation from biased doctor to homeless advocate served as redemption story, while Frank's presidential recognition continued inspiring healthcare reform, ensuring military sacrifice received institutional respect rather than appearance-based prejudice that training addressed through comprehensive education. Sometimes, the most powerful recognition comes from discovering hidden heroism, teaching us that everyone deserves medical care regardless of appearance, while authentic service transcends institutional prejudice when proper authorities intervene to restore dignity. That bias violates through healthcare prejudice requiring federal protection. The strongest people are usually fighting battles you know nothing about, and sometimes those battles involve protecting presidents while facing institutional prejudice that medical ethics should prevent, showing us that authentic heroism transcends appearance-based bias. When healthcare professionals choose compassion over assumptions, service over prejudice, and federal accountability ensures comprehensive care rather than judgment against heroes whose sacrifice exceeded their critics' contributions while deserving recognition rather than medical neglect.